Welcome to the Market Huddle Plus. I'm Kevin Muir, and this week we have the surprise guest that I've been looking forward to for some time. We are pleased to welcome Jon Hilsenrath, author and Wall Street Journal veteran, and the original, the OG Fed Whisperer. Jon, thanks for coming on.
Hey, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Well,
I'm assuming this is going to be just pick up where we left off at dinner a few weeks ago at StoneX. Let's just...
Poor Jon. I heard he was at the same event I was at, and I went and spoke to the guy that organized it, Michael, terrific guy from StoneX, and I said, can you put me beside Jon? I want to ask him some questions. And so I get beside him, and he immediately says to me, you want to know about the Fed, don't you? And I said, yeah. Is that like a common question? Does everyone want to know how it works?
Yeah, exactly. People always want to know, like, where do those stories come from when, something drops out of the air right before a meeting saying it's going to be a half and not a quarter. They're like, how does that happen?
Okay. So we're going to do that before we go and we start grilling you on the thing that everyone grills you on. Let's learn a little bit more about yourself. Where did you grow up? Did you always think you were going to be in finance? Give us like the arc of your career a little bit.
Oh, cool question. So I grew up on Long Island in New York in a town of bond traders. And I never thought I was going to be in finance. I never had, there were three things I ever wanted to be in my life. As a child, I wanted to be the ice cream man for obvious reasons. And as a teenager, I wanted to be the middle linebacker for the New York Giants. And then around 16, 17 years old, I discovered that I liked writing, and I decided that I wanted to be a writer and a journalist. And I kind of got into financial journalism by accident. We could talk about that if you want.
Sure.
But, I actually started writing for my town newspaper when I was 16 years old. We had a really good lacrosse team, and Long Island is lacrosse country, and they wanted a kid on the team who was literate, who could follow the team for a season. So they asked me. It turned out I was a better journalist than I was lacrosse player. And my friends started calling me Scoop, not because of anything I could do on a field to pick up a ball.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Just because, I wrote fun stories.
So before we get on, actually, I'd love to know a little bit why Long Island is the lacrosse kind of country. We've had Tony Greer, friend of the show, on. He's also lives, I believe, in Long Island, and all his kids play lacrosse. He's a big lacrosse fan. What's in the water over there?
It's interesting. There's four pockets in the country where lacrosse kind of took hold. One was Maryland, the Baltimore area. Another was Long Island. Another was upstate New York, and ironically, another was Colorado. I think the common denominator was that, lacrosse is a Native American sport, a sport of Native people. And as I'm sure you know, Kevin, it is the national sport of Canada.
Yes.
And,
Which seems wrong because we are big hockey fans. If you ask most people what it would be, they would choose hockey, but it is lacrosse. You're absolutely correct.
It is lacrosse. So I think it has something to do with the Native people, the roots of Native people on Long Island, but I don't really know.
Okay. So you start writing for your town paper, and then eventually do you go to journalism school? Like, walk us through what happened.
No, I went off to a college that had no journalism program, but I joined the school paper.
Okay.
And, what I wanted to do as a young guy, as a writer, was I wanted to become either a sports writer or a war correspondent. And I spent some time, I did a lot of sports writing when I was young. And then when I got out of college in 1989, I went and traveled and hitchhiked all over Eastern Europe and went to all, and I was really fortunate and lucky in timing. I was in Berlin when the wall was coming down and helped to knock it down, and traveled around the Soviet Union, had some cool experiences. But then the money ran out, and
wait, before you tell me about all the reality setting in, we got to talk about this. You were in Berlin when the wall was going down, you're there on the wall.
I helped to knock it down.
Tell us what that was like.
Sledgehammer in my hand, and
give us the story. And do you speak German?
So I had all right. So here's the whole story. So I had been in. I wanted to see the Soviet Union. I came up in the 1980s, and it was like evil empire, and you learn so much about this kind of dark place. And it kind of, and when we were kids, I'm probably a little older than you, Kevin, we would have these air raid drills, right? Where the sirens would go off and you'd have to hide under your desk with covering your head
Because that's going to be
and
effective for a nuclear
yeah,
bomb,
exactly.
right?
As if like when the nuclear bomb goes off, like you're going to be safe under your little 4-leg desk. But like I was just very curious about the place, so I went and traveled around it, around the Soviet Union, and then my sister was living in Israel. I went back to Israel, and while all of this kind of tumult was going on, I had a girlfriend back home who was breaking up with me.
Oh,
And I was heartbroken, and I was like, well, I'm not going back home. And then like all this stuff started happening in Eastern Europe. So I was like, screw it. I got on a plane, I flew to Paris, and I hitchhiked to Berlin. I was like, I want to be in the middle of this. My heart's going to be broken. So I hitchhiked to Berlin and, spent some time there and in Poland. And I was in Prague when Václav Havel got out of prison and was elevated to the leader of the country. It was just a really, really exciting time and a great time to not be attached to anything or anybody and see the world.
that is awesome. Okay, so you're there.
That was, by the way, my reality setting in was the breakup, but then the money ran out.
Okay.
And so I had, so I got back to the States and I needed something, and I won't belabor the point, but I ended up getting a job writing about economic statistics for a newswire service called Knight Ridder, which was at the time, believe it or not, was like a more dominant market force than this startup called Bloomberg.
Yeah.
And so I got this job in Washington covering economic statistics, and I was like, this sounds like the most boring thing I could ever imagine doing in my life. I'll do it for a year, and then after a year, I'll go off and do something that actually interests me. Because like I actually had taken one econ course in college. I went to Duke. And it was a terrible experience. It was the only C I'd gotten in my life besides home economics, ironically, in like 8th grade. And, it was just so abstract, and like the supply demand curves go this way and that way. What does all this mean? And, my friends back, those were the days of the movie Wall Street and Oliver Stone. And they were like cheering for Gordon Gekko. And I was like, this is not for me. I have no interest in this. I thought this was the first and last economics course I would ever take. But then I got the job, and I discovered that underneath all these abstractions and statistics was a really interesting universe populated by interesting people, including this Wizard of Oz like character named Alan Greenspan. And when I took the job, it was July 1990. Iraq was just invading Kuwait, and oil prices were going all over the place. The economy was going into recession. And I was like, this is actually kind of interesting. And then just to bring this to a point to a conclusion, I had grown up with, my dad was a doctor who had his own, very curious man who read the Wall Street Journal every day and had his own stock portfolio. And I woke up reading the New York Times sports section, and I watched him reading this like gray paper that didn't interest me called the Wall Street Journal. But then I came back and discovered it when I, started writing about economics. And I was like, that's the place where I've got to be. If I want to do this, then, I discovered the journal was filled with these like really beautifully written feature stories, really talented journalists. And so I set myself off to get to the journal. It took some time to do it, but that's where I ended up. It took me some time.
When you got there, what division were you in? Like, you obviously didn't become the Fed Whisperer. And by the way, you were and I was kidding about the original, but that position didn't really exist. You created the Fed Whisperer. You were, and in fact, I still call Nick John by accident. I go Hilsenrath, and then I'm like, oh no, it's Nick, and I keep forgetting because that spot wasn't there. But walk us through your career.
Well, that's all right. Well, so let me just stick to the Fed Whisperer thing, and then I'll talk about the journal, because there's a funny story attached to that. But that's actually not fair to people who preceded me. Greg Yip was a giant.
Oh, that's right.
And David Wessel was a giant, and Alan Murray was a giant. Like these people, the people who covered the Fed before I got there were exceptionally talented. Greg is one of the smartest people I know. He still writes an economics column for the Journal. Wessel is like the most plugged in financial journalist in Washington still, and he's not even in journalism anymore. So, I got lucky because actually what happened was Greg left the paper in the summer of 2008 to go to The Economist magazine. And I mean, as you know, the world was falling, the financial system was falling apart in the summer of 2008. It just so happened by then I had kind of climbed my way to up through the ranks and become the markets editor at the Journal. So I really understood what was going on in credit markets. You know, I could tell you how a credit default swap worked and how it differed from a collateralized debt obligation. And I also knew a lot of these economic figures because I covered academic economics. So they like desperately needed someone like right away to fill Greg's shoes. And I was like, yeah, I'll do that. Like, I mean, this, you know, my own view, because I had been in Asia in the 1990s, was that this crisis wasn't anywhere near ending, and it didn't end until there was massive government intervention. So I jumped at the opportunity, came down there, and was in the right place at the right time.
So did you had to move to Washington?
Yeah. I moved down from New York. So you asked a little bit of the trajectory.
Yeah.
I came in at the Journal at the lowest possible level a person could possibly enter that organization. I was like, if there was a life form lower than plankton in an ocean, that's what I was. So I was like Harry Potter. I worked in a closet in the basement of the Hong Kong bureau of the Asian Wall Street Journal, right? So there was the big Wall Street Journal, the mothership, right, based in New York, 1 million readers, you know, all the way back in the 1990s. And then the Journal had 2 satellite editions. They had the Asian Wall Street Journal and the European Wall Street Journal, which were more locally oriented and had much, much smaller subscription bases of, you know, like 80, 90,000 people, something like that. Smaller than the regional newspapers I worked for in college. And then the Asian Wall Street Journal decided to create a subsection, a weekly insert called Hong Kong Week. Okay. And literally the Hong Kong Week subsection of the Asian Wall Street Journal subsection of the Wall Street Journal had a smaller audience than the town paper I was writing for when I was 16 years old. And the newsroom was packed when they hired me. I took a $15,000 pay cut, and there was no space in the newsroom. So they literally put me in a closet in LG 5 levels below ground level on the same floor as the printing presses. Like we did our printing in the same building where we had our reporters, and they had this overflow closet that I shared with, you know, a couple of co-reporters who ended up becoming good friends. Chris Christie was one of them. And, you know, I just kind of worked my way up from very, you know, and I was 30 years old at the time and had my first kids. So it was a kind of lesson in some perseverance. I was not a rocket ship by any stretch. I was just like stubborn and had no alternatives.
I like that. That's awesome. Okay. So tell us about, you become the Fed Whisperer. Walk us through how that occurs and kind of your, you said that you kind of get frustrated with people, you know, asking about it and assuming that they know and that it's so easy and that you just get handed these things. And the reality is it's not like that at all. So why don't you just kind of fill us in and give us some color of what your life was like as the Fed Whisperer?
Yeah, you know, it's like there's a lot of complex dynamics under every kind of system, right? So I could talk a little bit about that, but sure. You know, it starts with kind of where we left off a moment ago. The Journal has always made the Fed beat a very high priority. So like Greg Ip was brilliant and was someone who was groomed by David Wessel for a while to go in and cover the Fed. And Greg was smarter than most of the people he covered. And David was like an anchor weight of the Wall Street Journal bureau in Washington for many years. So, you know, I came in and we already had a lot of credibility in the marketplace for our coverage. And because we had a lot of credibility in the marketplace, we had, you know, a lot of credibility with the Fed. And as you know, communication, I'll put my fingers up in air quotes, matters a lot to the Fed. And by that, I mean, you know, they understand that if they confuse markets, then they could cause a lot of problems for themselves, right? So for example, in 1992, I think it was, Greenspan did, I think it was a 0.75 percentage point interest rate increase, or maybe it was half. I can't remember. Maybe it was 94. I'm getting my history off. And the market was expecting a half. And, there was this kind of crisis in markets, and Orange County blew up and the Mexican peso blew up. And so the Fed has been very conscious for a long time that it's kind of incumbent on them to be as clear as possible about how they're thinking about the world, A. And then B, that became even more important after and during the financial crisis, because they had run out of tools to manage financial conditions, right? So usually you cut the interest rate and that spurs borrowing and spending and investment. But the interest rate they had cut to zero. So what they realized was that, like, if they really want to continue to affect financial conditions, they have to affect not only short-term interest rates, but interest rates out into a longer period, over, a year, 2 years, 3 years. And so they do that through communication. They do that, for instance, by saying, not only are rates zero now, we expect them to stay at zero for, X period of time. So they were really, really focused on communicating, and the Journal has, market power. So we mattered to them, right? Obviously they matter to us. And that's like the foundation for a complex dance that takes place between the institution that people cover, that I covered, and the institution that I was a part of the media. And and there were times, my attitude, I always used, when I was at the Journal, I always used to talk about first principles. Like, what are we doing here? What is our mission? And the way I described my mission as a beat reporter, was that I had 3 responsibilities. One was to break news. People paid a price to purchase the Wall Street Journal for a reason, right? They wanted an advantage. The other was to explain a complicated world.
Okay.
And the third was to hold an institution of power accountable, right?
Okay. And
I thought all 3 of those responsibilities were really important. And, there were times when the Fed wanted us to talk about some things, like explain a complicated world. Well, how are you thinking about communication strategy? They might engage on something like this. Yep. There were times when we made them really uncomfortable in holding them accountable. And I got some grief from this for people. But, I did stories with colleagues, for instance, disclosing that the chairman of the New York Fed, Steve Friedman, was buying and selling shares of Goldman Sachs, where he was a board member, while he was also the chairman of the New York Fed. And
you mean they've been doing this for longer than just the recent scandal? Like, this is tried and true, the Federal Reserve trading?
Oh yeah. No, it was worse then. And frankly, I wish in retrospect I had stayed on that story and done more follow-ups. My friend, our investigations editor, Mike Sicanolfi, who was like a pit bull, was like, yeah, we got to keep going after this. We got to keep going after this. But, it was actually shocking that the Journal Freudian slip, that the Fed didn't change its policies about stock ownership after those Steve Friedman stories that I did with the New York Bureau. But anyway, so those were, that was my mindset. I had, I wanted to break stories. I wanted to explain a complicated world, and I wanted to hold the place accountable where and when I could and should. Yeah. And so, it always came back to reporting. There were times and places where I had leverage, where the Fed had to talk to me. And there were times and places where, I didn't have as much leverage. And a lot of the job of a reporter is to maximize his leverage to get, to be able to get as much information and tell a story as possible. And so, it's not like, we can go deeper into this, but like a lot. And by the way, my successor, Nick Timrose, is he's an amazing reporter. He works I don't know if I'm allowed to curse.
Yeah,
on your
you can
program.
swear. Go ahead. Yeah,
He works his ass off. This guy is like up, like losing sleep when he thinks he's behind on some story. But it's about kind of building your leverage, right? So like one of the first things that I did when I got on the beat was just kind of build a mental map of the place, right? So, all right. So I want to know what's going on inside these policy meetings leading up to them and during them and after them. And so, literally the first thing I did was start go through meeting minutes and say, all right, who's in the meetings?
Right.
And try to get to know who these people were. And, I made a conscious decision to really work, for instance, the regional banks, because even though the regional bank presidents didn't have a lot of, the power was concentrated at the board and in the New York Fed, like the Philadelphia Fed or the Kansas City Fed didn't have a lot of leeway in kind of deciding what policy was going to be, but they were there. They were a part of the discussion.
Right.
And so I wanted to talk to everybody who was in those discussions and build up as much as I could, as I worked my way into the center of the institution to kind of nail down stories. I could talk about this in more detail.
Well,
but
can you talk about the dance as well that you've kind of alluded to and you've explained to me before in terms of like that there's like I remember asking you at dinner one time, I said like, okay, sometimes certain Fed presidents or regional chairmen or whatever they're called are actually leaking something to you to try to influence the other members of the FOMC board. And how does that all play out?
So remember how we were talking about how it used to piss me off when people said that I was the Fed whisperer?
Yeah.
You know what pissed me off even more is when people said that somebody was leaking something to me.
Okay.
Right. because like it makes it sound like I'm just sitting by my phone and, and like someone calls up and says, hey, John, I want to tell you this. That's just not the way it works. It's like, it's usually going the other way around. Like we're, and especially Nick, like I was good at kind of explaining the complicated world stuff and kind of looking around corners and seeing where the story was going. Greg was just brilliant and just understood everything. Wessel was like just really well connected. Nick's specialty is reporting. He's just a dogged reporter. But you're working the story all the time. So, people would get on the phone with you and and tell you their side of the story. And there were times when they wanted to influence I'll give you an example.
Okay.
Not only influence, but sometimes inform themselves. So I think this is in my book. So I wrote a book about Janet Yellen, and so Yellen.
What's the title of it? You're going to give the plug. Let's give the full plug. What's the title of it?
Well, the title is Yellen, but what the book is it's an economics book disguised as a love story. So the book is about Janet Yellen and her husband, George Akerlof, who won a Nobel Prize in economics. Yeah. And like, he's actually like the guy who came up with all these theories in the 1960s and 70s that markets aren't nearly as efficient as the kind of sacred models of economists kind of assumed they were. And so like, so you have this, and then they met at the Fed in the 1970s. And so you had this like really cool relationship where like the theorists, and Akerlof is a fascinating guy in his own right, totally absent-minded professor. The theorists came up with all these models that said, the traditional, or all these theories that said traditional economic models are flawed, because the quantum particle in the system is the human. And the human, is not the clean decision maker that you think him or her to be. And then Yellen comes along after like Akerlof's theories like demonstrated themselves to be true and accurate, that these markets were wildly inefficient in many ways. Yeah. And then, she was an economic policymaker for 25 years as all of these breakdowns were happening in our theories about trade and finance and market efficiency. And she had to kind of work at cleaning up a lot of the messes that, some people blamed her for. And so the book is basically the story of modern economics told through these two people, from Keynes all the way to the inflation outbreak of 2022.
Okay, there we go.
So, but anyway, but getting back to Yellen. So Yellen was sitting in San Francisco in 2008, 2009. And I get on the beat and, I want to talk to these regional bank presidents and just kind of hear what the world looks like for them and just like pick up whatever kernels I can about the internal debates as they're playing out. And, I would talk to Yellen and she would talk to me because she wanted to hear what was going on in Washington, and I was closer to the board physically than she was. And like, there was even a time when, so they launched these bailouts of Bear Stearns in March of 08. And then they did these like QE programs, and like Bernanke would sometimes have these off the record briefings with reporters after some big program got launched, right? And there were a couple of occasions where Yellen dialed into these things to his discussions with reporters because she just wanted to hear, what he was saying to people. And his, what hair he had left was on fire. And she didn't want to be like prodding him. He had 19 committee members to be dealing with too. So it's an information game, right? And everyone is trying to kind of learn what they can. And also, in the case of the senior people at the Fed, get certain messages out. And also for the regional bank presidents, some of my better sources were the people who didn't like the policies that were coming out of Washington. Because as you said, they wanted their point of view out there. Right. They wanted people to know, well, wait a second, we don't, we think that we're going to cause more inflation with these policies or whatever the case may be. And so, the way I saw my job was to get inside of all of this with a few kind of core operating journalistic principles, get inside the debate and learn as much as I could. I'll give you one other analogy. I'm a big football fan, and one of my good friends at the time covered the New York Giants for the Journal's New York Metro sports section. That was when we had a New York Metro sports section. Aditi Kinkleblad, she and I used to talk shop all the time because I wanted to hear what was going on in the New York Giants locker room. And she wanted to understand how this bizarre organization, the Wall Street Journal, worked. Okay. And I came to think of my beat as a little bit like a beat reporter on the football beat. You had game day, which was, FOMC 8 times a year at FOMC meetings. Yeah. But then the really interesting stuff was going on in the locker room, and in the meeting rooms before the game. Like for me, the FOMC meetings I was a little like those stories were kind of the least interesting ones because I had already written what we expected to happen. There was a little nervousness that I might have gotten, over my skis on some issue. But like for me, the really fascinating stuff was getting to know the personalities and telling you about the players and the coaches and the managers and the strategies and what was going on inside the locker room and the meeting room before game day.
Can I ask you to put aside your reporter hat and put on your pundit hat now? And sure. Do you think that the different voices from the Fed, meaning like the fact that you have all these different Fed FOMC members talking, is a positive or a negative for the markets? Like, does it help in conducting monetary policy to have so many different voices?
Well, first of all, I would say it is what it is. And like the point in some ways is moot.
Meaning that you're not going to change it, but couldn't they as an organization decide we're going to talk? We're only going to let the chair talk. Couldn't they do that?
Right. Yeah. Okay. All right. So you go and tell the presidents of the San Francisco Fed and the Cleveland Fed and the Richmond Fed that you're not allowed to talk anymore.
It's not going to go over well. No.
I mean, I don't think, there have been calls for unity at time, and there were definitely there was a lot of times, and I use this to my advantage, when the board was really frustrated with some of the people out there talking. Like when I was on the beat, like there was this this perception that Jim Bullard, the president of the St. Louis Fed, was like the Ben Bernanke whisperer. That like Bernanke would use him as a way to get his message out. And like that wasn't the case at all.
No,
Bullard would go out and freelance, and say,
we
need to launch a QE2 when like Bernanke was still trying to figure things out. And, he would just frustrate the hell out of people at the board,
right.
For going out and kind of saying his own thing. And then having it somehow ascribed to what, Bernanke thought. I see a little bit of that now with, oh God, help me out. The governor, I have an aphasia in my brain. I'll come back to it.
Okay, but it doesn't matter.
I still see this with
But like, I'm just thinking
officials.
it through, and like the fact that you say it's really the point is moot because we can't do anything about it. But I'm thinking about other central banks. You don't get, like, for example, here in Canada, there's no provincial, regional Bank of Canada governor speaking. And I don't even know, like in Europe, they do have different ones, but do they speak like as much?
Do you want to talk about the history of central banking in America? Because that's fundamental to this dialogue.
Sure,
and it's fascinating, right? So there was, and if you've seen the play Hamilton, you'll know a little bit of this history. So it goes all the way back to Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. So Hamilton and Jefferson fought, at the founding of the country itself over whether, and that's what this play is about, the musical, over whether the United States should have a central bank or not, and over whether a central government should pay the debts of various states incurred during the Revolutionary War. Hamilton wanted centralized power. He was a Federalist. Jefferson was an indebted farmer from Virginia and was dead set against it. And they battled over this issue, and Hamilton won. But there were fights all the way back to the founding between the different states who had different interests in what the structure of the financial system was going to look like in this in this new nation. And a lot of the agricultural states were not running the kinds of debts that some of the industrial states were running, and they didn't want to participate in this anyway. Fast forward, Andrew Jackson kills the central bank, and there was a long history of distrust, right. Particularly in outlying states and farmers towards New York. And towards bankers and towards centralized power that, then went all the way through Jackson, all the way through the 19th century. We had a series of financial crises. I could get into all this, but we don't have to. By 1907, ironically, 100 years before our 2007 financial crisis, there was another run on banks that J.P. Morgan, the individual, not the bank, the man, J.P. Morgan, had to resolve to provide liquidity to banks that were collapsing. And after the 1907 run, the powers that be in Washington and Wall Street decided we can't keep doing it like this. Right. We have these serial crises. We need to have a central bank like mature countries, like the Bank of England and the UK. And so they decided to create the Federal Reserve. Right. Okay. And it's federal. It was called federal. So because of this long history of mistrust, particularly in agrarian states, and because of the powers of Congress, they came up with this system where there would be a very powerful bank in New York, but there would be 11 other regional banks that were created around the country that had in many ways their own say on where to set a discount rate. And then a weak board in Washington, and ironically, two of this, and that what was created was just as the first bank of the United States was created at a compromise between Hamilton and Jefferson, the Federal Reserve System was a compromise created by Congress. So you had these weird things where you had two banks. You had St. Louis and Cleveland set up in the same state, right? Yeah. So, and that was all about power dynamics. Anyway,
I never even thought about that.
That was all about legislative power dynamics.
Yeah.
So anyway, then for variety. And by the way, this is all in my book. But the Fed fumbled the Great Depression in part because Benjamin Strong got sick, and he was the New York Fed president, and he was the most kind of powerful guy in the system, and wasn't capable of taking care of affairs. And then so they rewrote the Federal Reserve Act. They centralized power in Washington, but they kept the 12 regional banks. But like, there's a whole history underneath this system that you can't just undo.
So the reality is that,
but to come back to your point about all the noise,
yeah,
kind of, let's say you could change it.
Okay.
Philosophically, I don't have much of a problem with it because I feel like, listen, the world is complicated. That not only is the world complicated, but we all have different views of how to manage a complicated world.
Right.
And, frankly, I think the biggest mistake that the Fed has made, possibly in my 20, 30 years of following the institution, was when it walked in lockstep during and after COVID. Jay Powell actually did have, Powell hasn't had many dissents at all. And, he had, all the governors, all the presidents walking in lockstep with him with a unified voice, and they took all of these policies that tools that Bernanke created during the financial crisis, which was a demand shock. Right. And then they applied them to the supply shock of COVID. And we saw the outcome. We got this inflation outbreak. So
your argument is
the worst mistake that the Fed made there were a lot of regulatory problems in the Greenspan era that fed the financial crisis. We can talk about that. But in modern last 10, 20 years, the worst mistake the Fed made, I would argue, was that when they agreed and walked in unison with a very aggressive monetary stimulus in response to COVID, and then they stuck to it because there weren't people speaking up and saying, well, wait a second, Jay, why are we still buying bonds when the housing market is on fire? And when we've got all these supply shortages. And there were people at the Fed. There were people at the Fed who were starting to ask by, the fall of 2021. Wait a second, like why are we doing this QE program? And Powell's response was, I don't even want to talk about talking about it. Right. And it took them too long to unwind these things. And we're still dealing with the consequences. And, poor Joe Biden and Kamala Harris lost their jobs as a result.
One of the things that I think that was a big mistake on on Powell's part was this idea that you couldn't raise rates while you were doing QE. He said that there was a period where they all agreed they were going to raise rates, that we knew they were going to raise rates, but there was still a month or two left of QE. And his argument was you can't be doing policy that is actually stimulative, QE, and at the same time raise rates because it's sending conflicting messages. And I was like, listen, buddy, I get it. You got to do your QE because you've you promised this, you've committed to this. But from a plumbing perspective, that's bullshit. Like you can do it. But
I would argue I half agree with you, which is better than we did over dinner, I think. but I think the problem there was, it is incoherent to be raising rates and doing QE at the same time. But the problem there was that the Fed is an extremely inertial institution. Okay, and I've seen this over and over again. And the Fed, and this is part of their communication and messaging problem, is it's part of this really kind of large body of 19 decision makers and the challenge of reaching consensus. It takes them time to recognize a problem, discuss a problem, agree to a solution to the problem, communicate their solution to the problem, and then act on their solution that they've communicated. When there's a crisis, that can all happen in 48 hours. But in normal times, when the Fed is going about its business and its processes of preparing for a meeting and having internal memo exchanges and the chairman reaching out and talking to the regional, in the normal state of affairs, it takes months for this stuff to play out. And they responded very quickly to putting these policies in place during COVID. And then they went back to business as usual in terms of unwinding them. And the fundamental problem was that, frankly, Powell just misdiagnosed the crisis.
Right.
And,
which is back to your point about the fact that he applied, this policy of stimulus into a supply shock.
Yeah. And to me, the problem wasn't that QE existed as a tool. The problem was you took that hammer and you used it where you should have been using a screwdriver.
Right. Not only that, you made it the biggest hammer you could ever use. Like the numbers were just obscene.
Yeah.
Like in terms of what they did. Okay, 1 second. We gotta talk about like markets and before we get off this topic of the Fed whisper and stuff like that. And you take great offense to the idea that this is leaked. Which I completely understand
because it understates the work that reporters put in.
And I completely get it.
Can I tell you a story?
Yeah.
So here, and I think we talked about this at dinner, but so like, here's an example of the way this sometimes looked, right, and the way it was received in the marketplace, right? So there were a number of occasions where I would put, the Journal would put out a story at like 3:30 in the afternoon. I was covering all these QE programs, and the story would be like, Fed considering taking first step. I'm just making this up. First step towards QE at August meeting. And it would go out at 3:30. And the markets would react. And then all of a sudden, all these like hysterical people on Twitter and wherever, which I never joined, would say, that was a leak. Bernanke handed that to Hilsenrath because because the market was down and stick saved by Bernanke, and like he was trying to save the market and turn it around it was like so vain of these people to think that Bernanke was just sitting around thinking that like he wanted to turn a down 1% day into an up 1% day. But but this is the way it would look like in my world, right? So I had spent days or weeks reporting out a story, kind of nibbling around the edges, talking to, not only regional bank presidents, but people in finance, on Wall Street, hedge funds, banks, academics, trying to understand what questions I needed to be asking, so that, so that even like a slight tweak of wording I could kind of pick up on, and then, put my story together right as blackout is about to start. And then, I'd file it at like, say, 8:00 in the morning, knowing that it was going to have to go through some editing process, and it would get through editor number 1 in Washington. And she would say, well, what about this? And what about that? And, I think your lead should say this, and yada, yada, yada. And then it was like, go back and forth. And then it goes on to New York. And then, it goes through the news desk in New York, and they're like, well, what about this? And what about that? And then by like the 2:00 meeting, which they should have known at 8:00, they're like, oh, we want to put this on page 1. So then it's got to go to page 1. And it's like, well, what about this? And what about that? And they like freaking torturing me for hours, right? And then it goes through page 1, and the top editor is like, well, yeah, but what about this? And what about that? And then it's like, then it's 3:00, like the whole day has passed. It's like, God damn it. Like, get the story out. Like the markets are about to close, and let's stop fiddling with all of this stuff. And I'm arguing all the way because I think my words are precious, and and I'm driving all the editors crazy. But I also think, I know the material. I know like some little nuances, like someone's going to freak out about it on Wall Street if it's misconstrued. So then by 3:30 in the afternoon, there's this one mad last dash to get the story out, and it goes out, and people were like, oh, Bernanke must have called Hilsenrath and told him to put this out. It's like, no, this like so much time went into this, and so much effort.
Okay. So. But there are times and that the Fed chair wants to move the market in the final days before the meeting. Is that not correct? Or it has happened in the past?
Okay. I want to choose my words. I want to choose my words carefully here.
Okay. And if you don't want to answer it, that's fine.
No, I'll say every chair is different.
Okay.
And every chair has his or her own style and approach to managing expectations.
Okay.
Right. Bernanke, he would sometimes he'd drop things once or twice in congressional testimony, and Bernanke was always very sensitive to the dynamics of the committee. It would piss off regional bank presidents when the Journal had a story saying, the Fed is going to do this or that, and people would show up in a meeting and they'd be like, why am I reading about this in the Wall Street Journal? Yeah, Bernanke was kind of sensitive to that stuff.
Okay.
I actually knew Powell when he was a governor, and I covered him a little bit as a chair. But I didn't have the same kind of relationship with him that I had with Bernanke and Yellen. And, I got to know Greenspan too. Every one of them is different. I will acknowledge that we have seen a couple of these moments over the last couple of years where it seemed like material was getting out there during the blackout, and people were like, well, what's that all about? And, because, I'm not there, I can't get inside of it, and I'm not going to pretend to. My view is that the Fed's blackouts are not helpful anymore, that they should shorten the blackout periods. But, to pull the lens back, did the senior most people at the Fed ever talk to reporters? And by senior most, I don't mean just chair. I mean the vice chair and the New York Fed president. Like, did they talk to reporters? Yeah, they talked to reporters,
right?
Because they had to. Because but like I say, this is all a dance, and they understood that if we didn't get what was going on, then we could convey something through our stories that could make their jobs much more difficult.
Right.
So, but the thing is, I don't think the point I was trying to make with that story about the 330 story is that people can tell themselves stories about what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And I think it's most helpful to understand that it's like this complex dynamic and this complex dance, and reporters are trying to use their leverage, and the Fed officials are trying to use their leverage in all these different ways. And it comes together at different times. But very often when people think they know and understand what was behind it, it's more complex than they might have realized. Now, the problem is when some story comes out during blackout and you're like, well, wait a second, why is that coming out during blackout? Is this real or is it not real? And that's where I think the blackout rules are. It's gotten to a point where if they probably should shorten that whole period, but then you get into all kinds of disclosure issues, because the regional bank, all of these members of the FOMC are sitting on confidential documents. It's, they start circulating meeting materials the day the blackout starts. So they don't want people talking to reporters during that period, because, the president of the regional bank of Tuscaloosa is kind of knows this material, and that could be seen as
what I took from our conversation, you don't have to comment, is that most people are assigning kind of this grand plan and these nefarious reasons for a lot of this. And the reality is that that's not how it works. And you kind of explain the dance, but there are the occasional times when the Federal Reserve purposely shifts expectations close to a meeting because they don't want to surprise the market.
It's looked at that way lately.
Yeah. Okay. Well, anyways, we'll just leave it at that. All right. Let's talk about the markets.
At times. Yeah.
Let's talk about the market, what you see here. Let's start with Trump. One of the things that when you were on the panel, you put out this comment that seemed to shock the audience. You said, I could see a point where Trump actually threatens to not pay the interest to the Chinese holders of their bonds.
Oh boy, you're holding me out there on.
No, you know what? I apologize if you don't want me to have said that, but I agree with you.
I said it, so I got to own it, right?
No, but I agree with you, and I think that too often people, and you weren't saying he wasn't going to pay, because that you weren't saying that at all. You were just saying he could threaten this. And I think that that is very much a possibility. And you have to keep your mind open to that possibility. And so I would love to hear how you think that this, how Trump is affecting markets, what you see is going on, any sort of insights, color that you have about.
And there's so much to unpack there. And I'm sitting here for a moment trying to figure out where to start the unpacking process. So I'll make two big picture points.
Okay.
The first one is that this is not going to shock or horrify anybody, but the United States has a debt and deficit problem. What is the number now? Close to $30 trillion gross debt. Net debt is smaller. $2 trillion annual budget deficits. We spend more now on interest. We spent more last year on interest on the debt than we spent on defense. And annual interest costs as a share of GDP are rising, and back, by the way, to where they were in the early 90s when bond market vigilantes ruled Wall Street.
Right.
We went through a period of secular stagnation where growth and investment globally was soft. Larry Summers called it secular stagnation. Inflation was very low, in part because of all the labor capacity that China added to the global economy. And so we went through this period where savings was high, investment was low, interest rates were low, inflation was low, and there was a lot of demand for U.S. Treasury securities.
Okay.
Right. And so we could finance these really big budget deficits for next to nothing. My own view is that period is over. Right. Okay. There's a huge demand right now for investment, for AI, for energy, for housing in the United States, for a wide number of things. And in my view, secular stagnation is over, which means it's going to be more costly to finance this debt. All right. So there's a debt problem. And I think that the markets are the most important guardrail on this presidency. It's not anyone in the House or the Senate or the courts. It's the markets. And I think that what Trump is going to discover is that the markets are no longer underwriting really inexpensive funding of the debt. And he could badger the Fed all he wants. That's not going to change that fact. Right. So that's point A. So point B is, when you think about this White House, what is the underlying narrative of Donald Trump? It's a rejection of the modern global order that was built in the post-World War II period. And part of that, fundamental to that rejection is our America's trade relations and the terms of those trade relationships, but also our military alliances and the terms of those alliances. And his determination to use the power, America's economic and financial might, and the power of the United States dollar for the United States to rewrite the terms of these global relationships, right? And by the way, this idea didn't start with Donald Trump. We as a country have been using, us Americans, I know you're Canadian, so we've been using sanctions and the power of the international, the dollar and the global lending system to impose our will on North Korea and Iran and Russia. So this isn't new. But what Trump wants to do is extend that on a grand scale, first through the use of tariffs. But so then I started saying to myself, well, how else might one do that? And when you think about the debt problem that we have, and he keeps saying we're going to pay off the debt, and the deficit problem that you have, I could see someone putting the idea in his head, and then you have a lot of these foreign central banks and foreign governments, holding their reserves at the New York Fed. Yeah. So all these, China, a lot of these Chinese holdings are there. What's to prevent them from waking up one day and say, listen, you guys cheated in your trade relationship with us. Yeah. So, these debt agreements are no longer good. They're no longer valid. I'm voiding them. like, this is me just spinning my wheel to say, like, this is what I was talking about earlier, kind of looking around corners. That's like one of the things I'm good at. Nick is a much better reporter than me. Greg is much smarter than me. Wessel is just, but like I was always good at looking around corners, or just like using my imagination to think, well, where could this story go?
Right.
And so that's one thing. And I was talking to someone who had the similar idea, who was saying that, yeah, that's the kind of thing that he worries about. Now, so could Trump feasibly threaten that? Could he feasibly even try to do it? Yeah, he actually could. But I think at the end of the day, the guardrail would be the bond market, because the bond market would puke all over it and he would realize he couldn't get away with it. I think we could discover in a matter of days, if he proceeds with these threats to impose tariffs on Canada and Mexico, that the stock market will puke all over that, and he might have to find some off ramp on that threat. But I think his, like, the institution, ironically, the institution that is most likely to kind of take some of these more far, kind of restrain some of these more far out ideas, is our capitalist system of economics and finance,
Right.
which ironically, the kind of the voice of the Republican Party is a guy who wants to impose his will on all of these facets of the way we live. And I think the markets themselves are going to be like, we don't operate that way. Here's another example. I'm going to lower the price of oil. Drill, baby, drill. Liquid gold. Well, guess what? The producers, whether you're OPEC or you're operating in the Permian basin, they don't want to drill, baby, drill, because they've been caught in these. You probably know more about this than I do. I'd love to hear of you, but they've been caught in these, kind of overproduction traps before,
Right.
And that's a great way to drive yourself into bankruptcy. Yeah. So I don't think there's, we're already producing record amounts domestically of natural gas and crude, but
well, isn't that just
the markets dictate a point and a profit motive? This is a market system.
Yeah. Well, listen, I'm with you. This is one of the things that I've been pushing on, is that Trump, so many things that he says are like a paradox. Like, he'll say, I want the trade deficit to be zero.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think if the trade deficit would go to zero, I think that stocks would go sell off. I think bonds would sell off. On the other side of the trade deficit is a recycling of US dollars in the US financial system.
Right.
So, or he'll say things like, I want the reserve currency to be the US dollar. Yep, China and Japan, their currencies are too low. And then that one, actually, I could actually reason through, because being the reserve currency doesn't mean being the strongest currency. It merely means being the currency that everyone transacts in.
Right.
But I do think that you're onto something, that the ultimate kind of guardrail, and I love that line, will be the markets. And so you said something about the fact that if Trump goes ahead and does this 25% tariff on the US and Mexico, the stock market might sell off. Or Canada and Mexico. The stock market might sell off.
Yeah.
Do you think that like, I'm not sure the market is going to be as efficient as you think. I think over the long run it will be, but you're counting on that the kind of almost like a bond vigilante that's turned into like a financial market vigilante. And I'm not sure that, like, it feels to me like I went to New York City and was with you at that panel, and everyone was like super bullish. Everyone I talked to was just so excited about the deregulation, about the coming of the new age and stuff like that. So I'm not as confident as you are that the market is as quick to punish them as you.
Yeah, I agree with you. The market can be very slow to pick up on ideas and could attach itself to ideas that you use the word paradox. I think that was gentle, I would say, or sometimes incoherent. So I agree with that. But, like part of my mental model is 2018, and the S&P 500 fell 6% in 2018 when we were going through all of these trade tantrums. And it was one of the more volatile years that we've had for stocks. And so I think that's kind of a good model for the way things could play out this year. I think part of the optimism that you were picking up on and that I was seeing and that kind of carried the market for a month after the election was this idea that, and this actually was an idea that Trump's senior advisors were selling to people like me, that this is just a negotiating tool. He just wants to make these threats, in order to convince countries, like he just did it with Colombia, right?
Right.
Take these deportees or I'll jack up. But the problem with that is, you do that once or twice or three times and you back off.
Nobody will take you seriously.
And no one will take you seriously. So at some point he's going to have to follow through on these threats, or else the threats cease to work, have any meaning. And I think when the market wakes up to that day, and it might be right. I mean, I don't know. Maybe he'll find an off ramp with Canada and Mexico, but when he decides it's like, now is the time to do it, he's got some honeymoon in the market. But, and by the way, that honeymoon was, he didn't have a honeymoon in the bond market. I mean,
no, you're right.
U.S. Treasury yields have come down a little bit because we had a couple of reads of good inflation data, but the bond market's response to his election was to sell off. And this is where we get incoherent. I want to get rid of our trade deficit. Okay, well, one way to get rid of your trade deficit is to stop stimulating domestic demand,
right? With
$2 trillion budget deficits.
Yeah,
a trade deficit is a function of your national level of savings.
Yep,
right.
Completely.
And if you're going to,
yep. So. Completely agree. Okay, we're getting long. Let's go with
what. Again, you have a cat in it?
Yeah, I have a cat as well. She comes and visits every now and then. I got my dog sleeping behind me and the cat. So what question would you like? I've asked you a bunch of different things. What question did I miss that you'd like to chat about with to end our conversation here?
Oh boy, open-ended,
man. You just pick it.
So, I mean, I guess
like what's on your mind?
What's that?
What's on your mind? Like, what do you think about, like, when you're like, what are you excited when you go visit clients? And by the way, you are, you do go visit clients. You are consultant at StoneX.
I've hung out my own shingle, which is, and that actually kind of relates to what I'll say. I think we live in a fascinating time in human history. I think we are living through a revolution. And I think we've been living through a revolution actually for more than 20 years. It's an information technology revolution with some historical parallels. When I think about when I was that young guy in high school wanting to be a sports writer, I wrote on a typewriter. When I wanted to call a friend, there was a box attached to a wall by a wire called a telephone that I picked up. And when that friend was on the phone, I got a signal that went, and then I had to keep trying. When I wanted to write to a friend far away, I took out a piece of paper and wrote a letter with a pen or a pencil, stuck it in an envelope, closed the envelope, licked a stamp, put it on the stamp, put it in a big blue box, and then sent the letter in there and waited for a couple of weeks for a response. If I had to research some project, I went to a library or I went to my father's Encyclopedia Britannica. If I wanted to memorialize a moment, I had another black box called a camera with these things called rolls of film in it. I could take 24 or 36 rolls at a time and then bring them to a store, drop them off, spend $30, $50, $40 to get them developed and wait. Everything I just described is now instantaneous, nearly infinite, and almost costless. That's what we've been living through, right? And everything I've described is about to go on hyperspeed with artificial intelligence, because now I don't have to do any of this work myself. I'm going to have a personal assistant on my phone within a few years where I'm going to say, hey, call Kevin and ask him if we can do this at 2:00 instead of 11:00. And my digital personal assistant will do those things for me. we're living through this information revolution, and that's fundamentally, in addition to globalization and global trade, it's changed the way humans work. And it's created a barbell economy. This is the stuff that I get excited talking about.
Okay.
We have few people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg who have gotten super rich. And then we have a lot of people who've been kind of forced into lower end tasks that can't be replaced by machines like manicurists, which, by the way, the fastest growing occupation in America in the last 25 years, among occupations that existed 25 years ago, the fastest growing occupation in America is manicurists and pedicurists.
Wow.
And the middle has been hollowed out by globalization and technology. And like in my mind, there's no, and this is where I think there's some incoherence in this election, because I don't think any of our like kind of worldly leaders have really kind of told the story effectively. But there's no promise in economics that one era will create more or less middle class jobs than another, right? So the industrial era was uniquely suited to create middle class work, because you needed all these people attached to all these machines to make all these sneakers and hair dryers and televisions, right?
Okay.
And so, but before the industrial era, the agrarian era was highly unequal. And we had entire political systems built around that inequality, feudal systems, aristocracies, and all that stuff. And now we're going into this new era. We're in it. We're in this new era. We're in a post-industrial information technology era. And there's no promise written anywhere that it has to create a lot of middle-class work. And that's a very, very disruptive thought. And I think it helps to explain a lot of what's happened over the last few years, and how, Donald Trump pulled off one of the greatest heists in human history. He stole the working class, disaffected working class from the Democratic Party, because he tapped into this disaffection in ways that the Democrats, were too slow in their thinking to figure out. I'm still waiting to see if he's got solutions to this problem that I'm talking about. And frankly, when we talk about making America an industrial powerhouse again, that's not doing it for me. So, I think we're living through revolutionary times. And I think that, that as we've seen through other revolutionary times, that's exciting and scary. And you need to, I'm sorry, my phone is ringing.
No problem.
You need to be nimble. And part of this information revolution is that old institutions of power, news organizations, are melting away in the same way that the aristocracy melted away when when humans developed printing presses and started finding new ways to communicate to the masses. So, I think you got to be, fast and nimble. And so I give you credit, Kevin, for you've been doing that, right? You started your podcast. You're just like doing new things. And so I'm excited at this point in my life to be off on my own and doing new things and trying to just stay ahead of the tidal wave.
All right. That's a great way to end it. Now, before you go, let's tell people where they can learn more about you. And earlier you explained that you weren't on Twitter, and I completely respect that decision. But you did have a goal. What was your goal? You told me.
Well, so my goal was to add 500 or 1,000, because I know everybody listens to you, right? So I want 1,000 new people to log into my LinkedIn page. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I'm doing. So I left the Journal a little over a year ago. I've started my own business. My father was a war refugee who came to America in 1941, stowed away in the hull of a ship called the Serpa Pinto, Portuguese passenger ship. And he had a hard childhood, hard upbringing, and he ended up living the American dream. So I've started my own business. It's called Serpa Pinto Advisory. I'm doing a lot of work talking about the economy and markets. I work as a senior advisor to StoneX, writing about the Fed. I have a bunch of other engagements, and I'm figuring things out. My main social platform right now is LinkedIn. I'll have a website at some point, but right now I'm just like saying things that are on my mind and communicating with people on LinkedIn. So go there, find me there, and say Kevin sent you.
Okay, so huddlers,
Wait, I've got one other thing, Kevin.
Yeah, sure.
Because I know people drink on your show, right?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. So I took out a bottle of Woodford. I realized we're going a little early.
Yeah.
Like,
so
are we
you
expected to drink some today?
No, well, this is kind of, it's for me, it is too early to drink. And unfortunately, it's my partner, the true recreational alcoholic. I actually, well, it's not going to stop. I like it. Well done, Jon. Well done. So huddlers, listen up. We got to go, and I'm
going to have a wee dram of
there we go.
Of whiskey.
And by the way, that is American, right? Because I think that is what we're going to be tariffing back. I've seen the list, and I think that is
This is bourbon from Red Country,
right? So I think that is something that we wouldn't be able to have in Canada, or it's going to be more expensive at the very least. So listen, huddlers, go to LinkedIn. Go find Jon and follow him. Tell him that you loved his stuff and that you love hearing about it. And for those, the other thing I will say, Jon, is that I suspect that now that people know that you are willing to do podcasts, you will get much more invites.
Let's do it. I love it.
So for folks that are on other podcasts that want to go and listen to more from Jon, feel free to reach out via LinkedIn only. LinkedIn only. That's how he does it.
For now.
That's right.
Thank you so much, Kevin. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you for letting me talk.
Oh, man, it was great having you on the show. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate your time.
Me too.